Hi, Marcy.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're Marcy Wheeler. You write the blog Empty Wheel, among other things. You're a journalist. You write for The Guardian sometimes, Huffington Post sometimes. And I've got to say there's no one I would rather be talking to right now because yesterday James Comey made headlines with his testimony to a congressional committee. And there's nobody whose analysis of this I'd rather hear than yours. This is kind of your beat. The whole area of, surveillance as it pertains to civil liberties. And that's gotten you into kind of all the issues that this touches on. You blog very prolifically, on this stuff. So let me start by asking you, so there were two basic headlines. One was expected, that Comey was going to say, that as director of the FBI, he was not aware of any evidence to support Donald Trump's claim that President Obama in some sense had wiretapped him or Trump Tower or anything like that. That was expected. So the thing that kind of made bigger headlines is his saying that there was an ongoing investigation into connections between the Trump campaign and Russian influence on the election in the form of hacking and so on. Now, let me start by asking, do you think the second headline deserved the big play it got?
No, I mean, we've known that. So it was confirmation of what we already knew. What was interesting is he put a time to it. He said the investigation started in July, and way at the end of the hearing, Elise Stefanik from Northern New York asked him some questions about when Congress got briefed on the investigation. And it revealed stuff that we had kind of seen bubbling out into the press, which is that at least Devin Nunes and Adam Schiff.
Nunes is head of the committee, and Schiff is
the ranking member. Yeah.
The ranking Democrat, yeah.
They had not been briefed on the substance of this investigation until the last month. And so Stefanik first walked Comey through how it's normally supposed to work, which is that first, FBI for counterintelligence investigations, FBI's counterintelligence division briefs the Justice Department, ODNI, and then some people in National Security Council, and then we'll brief what's called the Gang of Four. So Nunes, Schiff, and also their counterparts in the Senate, Richard Burr, and now Mark Warner on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And Stefanik basically got him to admit that had not happened until the last month. And his explanation for why was that the investigation was so sensitive, and then she used the term so serious, that it had been on a very close hold within the executive branch, and therefore, because the implication is, and this kind of takes Comey a step further than where he went, the implication is because they hadn't briefed everyone in the executive branch, they weren't yet willing to brief the Gang of Four, which raises questions about why they hadn't briefed everyone in the executive branch, particularly given that the National Security Advisor was forced to resign. That would be Mike Flynn, who's clearly one of the people who would be of interest to this investigation. And Jeff Sessions was forced to recuse, the Attorney General, who also had some conversations with the Russians that he didn't disclose.
So the idea is that the only reason they wouldn't have disclosed the investigation throughout the executive branch is if there are people in the executive branch who are kind of central to the investigation?
Yeah, that's one argument.
That's the inference that you think is interesting.
Yeah, yes, because, the other thing is that there's been questions from Democrats, legitimately since July, and I think less legitimately since October. Jim Comey made this disastrous decision back in July to, in announcing there were no charges against Hillary Clinton or any of her aides and her email server classified information, blah, 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 that, he went well beyond what he should have and said that she was very reckless, and he tried to explain it, and it went down and that led to him making another announcement, less than 10 days before the election, where he said that it was reopening. And Democrats have complained, they've rightly complained that Jim Comey was totally out of bounds for making those comments, but they've in turn said, well, why aren't you also making statements about this investigation into Trump and Russians and so on and so forth? And I think that, this is a counterintelligence investigation of ongoing relationships between Trump's people and Russians, right? Mm-hmm. Since the investigation has started, at least one person who might be a source for this Christopher Steele dossier that implicated Trump and his aides and a lot of ties to Russia, at least one person who may have been a source for that was killed under kind of unusual for normal people circumstances, but possibly not unusual for Russian circumstances. And 4 people have been arrested for treason in Russia. And so the reason you don't release details of a counterintelligence investigation is because you worry that people are going to get killed or arrested. And guess what? People have already gotten killed and arrested over the course of this investigation. So,
So are you saying he may have some grounds for playing this closer to his hand than he played the Hillary investigation?
Not only that, but the other thing people always forget is that until this year, there was an entity called Shadow Brokers, which probably was also tied to the DNC leak, that was leaking NSA hacking tools all over the internet. Mm-hmm. And that suggests far greater counterintelligence compromise than just somebody hacking into a server. And the notion that we should then, publicize what we know is really counterproductive to a real investigation. So right. It's sort of, if Democrats want a real investigation, they should be tolerant of limiting the investigation to where it can be kept reasonably secret. If they want a big showy investigation that will lead immediately to Trump's, impeachment, then they may have to forego a real investigation on the counterintelligence side. Okay,
so there's a lot there, and ultimately there's a kind of intersection between the two headlines, I think. In other words, if you ask, well, what actual thing did lie at the bottom of Trump's weird and essentially unfounded allegation about Obama's wiretapping, then that actually, I think the answer to that, or the probable answer to that, does have a kind of connection to the question of Russian influence on the election. And we can get to the exact connection there, but so let's review a little. First of all, you think it's a reasonable inference from some things that Comey said that we just discussed, that maybe there are people in the administration who are actually kind of central to the investigation, centrally involved in the ongoing investigation, or at least people who either in the executive branch or who have been in the executive branch. At one point that would have been Flynn before he left.
Or in the campaign.
Although he presumably would have been free, Comey presumably would have been free to disclose information within the executive branch about people who were in the campaign who were not in the executive branch at that point, right?
Well, sure, unless you believe that, that there's a channel going back and forth.
Okay, so that might have, yeah. So, anyway, what do you think are the most, setting that somewhat aside, what do you think are the most likely actual forms of involvement there may have been of the Trump campaign in the Russian activities, or the closest connection there may have been? I mean, let's start with Flynn. We know about that phone call that he had, that and it's his lying about that led to his demise. His
as far as we know.
As far as we know, that was the ostensible reason that he had a conversation with the Russians. He supposedly told the vice president that he didn't talk about the sanctions that the Obama administration had imposed on Russia, and that supposedly was a lie. That supposedly is the reason he's gone. Now, that conversation itself, if indeed he discussed the sanctions, has never struck me as all that extraordinary. I mean, you would almost expect an incoming administration to do a little, some form of implicit or explicit communication.
Yeah, and as I say, I mean, it's not like Trump hid that he was running on a pro-Russian platform.
Right.
Right? Voters knew that when they went to the polls and elected him president on November 8th. So the notion that that Mike Flynn might say to Kislyak, hold off on responding to the sanctions, we're going to try and reestablish this relationship, that is not inconsistent with the kinds of things that Trump said on the campaign. Where I think the reason I say, as far as we know, that's why Flynn resigned, is because shortly after Flynn resigned, all of a sudden he filed foreign agent FARA. Basically the paperwork for when you are acting as an agent of a foreign government for both Turkey and Russia. So, and the Turkey thing is actually more interesting than the Russia thing to me. But basically he disclosed that he had gotten about $50,000 from Russian entities, mostly for innocent stuff. Again, he appeared at an RT event. Actually, RT kind of negotiated his agent down.
This is the Russian media operation and often described as a propaganda operation.
Right. So he did that. He spoke to a freight airplane entity and spoke to Kaspersky, which is a cybersecurity entity. The Kaspersky event is really interesting because it was in the United States, and Mike McCall, who is the Homeland Security chair in the House, also spoke at that event. So the event itself, no one cares that he spoke at it, that McCall did. The event itself is not incriminating. What's incriminating is that Flynn disclosed none of that. And then the Turkey thing is more troubling. He was serving as an agent for Turkey. He wrote an op-ed basically saying that we should take Turkey's side in the post-coup politics. And that is the direction that the Trump administration has been taking. And so here we have a case of an undisclosed foreign agent working within the government, formulating policy in a way that served the people who were paying him. And the fact that he disclosed that really quickly afterwards, the fact that, there was much made of DOJ contacting the White House and the White House doing nothing, suggests to me that, that the leaks were done to force the White House to get Flynn to quit, and that there's probably more discussions going on between DOJ and Flynn about how he saves his bacon from not having disclosed this stuff, which, again, by itself might not be that incriminating, but everyone in the Trump administration failed to disclose the same kinds of conversations. And then I think in bulk, they become interesting. Okay.
So then there is, in terms of the Russia thing, there's also Paul Manafort, who was never a member of the administration, but was the campaign manager. Contrary to Sean Spicer's suggestion that he had played a marginal role in the campaign, he was the manager of the campaign for some months. And he, of course, was, and I should say that, well, maybe we should ask, what kinds of connection could there have been between Trump campaign people and Russia? One possibility is quid pro quo. There was a feature of the Republican platform that the Trump campaign seemed pretty intent on either keeping in or adding. Anyway, they wanted to make sure that there was no commitment to supply arms to Ukraine against Russian proxies or Russia or anything. So that's the kind of thing, and it was, it was kind of conspicuous, and it's not like some of the things Trump wanted to do that were fairly obviously done at the behest of donors. Some interventions in the platform make sense in terms of his constituency or known donors. This kind of doesn't quite. So that's an example of a quid pro quo, and you can imagine Manafort's involvement. We can get to that. Are there other forms aside from just quid pro quo, and also quid pro quo could involve actual policies, not just platform planks, but actual policies and so on. Are there other forms of connection?
Yeah, I sort of think of the interest in Trump and Russia in three different kind of categories. One is Trump has ties, because he's in the real estate business, he has ties going back decades with mobbed up Russians, right? Some of his buildings appear to be money laundering facilities for Russian oligarchs, and he has actually had to pay a giant fine for not taking adequate protections against money laundering. So that is not, the DOJ has never decided to charge him, but that is the kind of thing that going forward could compromise him. So no crime committed could compromise him because he has his brand and his money is so closely tied to all these Russian oligarchs. That's one. But that's not just Russian oligarchs. There are lots of oligarchs in his towers, and they're all kind of, they all have this money sloshing around. So I didn't quite realize that. Is there so much of this that the idea is that a substantial part of the income from some of his real estate holdings actually comes from money laundering? I mean, I know there's a famous case where this Russian seems to have overpaid for Trump property in Florida. Yeah, there's that. But more specifically in his condo developments, a number of them, including Soho, which was funded by, actually the funding had ties to sordid Russian tied, blah, 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 that people were buying these condos and not living in them and using the condos themselves as a vehicle for them to money launder. I'm not accusing Trump of money laundering, but this is something in the cash economy that we're seeing in big cities anyway. And it's not just Russians. People are bringing money into the United States and trying to launder it through buildings, and Trump's buildings happen to really be tailor-made for that because they're expensive and they, it happens, it works. So that's one allegation, right? But again, we saw him get a new brand in China for, among other things, escort services. It's not Trump's business ties that might expose him, that might compromise him, are not limited to Russia. Okay. They're global. The next thing is quid pro quo on policy. We talked about the Russian platform. Just as interesting is that Steele dossier done by MI5 office, former MI5. MI5
Here the idea was that Russia, the government, had been gathering compromising information on Trump, including his frolicking with prostitutes in ways that don't seem appealing to most people, and so on.
No, actually there is that. That was the headline thing, the first report. But the more interesting ones that both Manafort and Carter Page and Michael Cohen, who is Trump's longtime lawyer. And
Carter Page is this kind of eccentric figure who had some sort of connection to the campaign. And keeps coming on TV and saying things he probably shouldn't have said. But anyway, go.
Yeah, the other people at least have gotten quiet. Like, we haven't heard from Manafort. We haven't heard from Flynn in a while.
I like Carter Page. I want him to be on TV more often. He's kind of weirdly endearing.
Well, because he's dumb enough to come on TV, but regardless. So there are examples of potential quid pro quo. So, for example, in the summer, there is an allegation that Carter Page talked to Russians and was offered the brokerage fees on the sale of 19% of Rosneft oil company to some private entity. That sale went through in December, and it's not clear who got the brokerage fees. And the quid pro quo on that was supposed to be ending sanctions on Russia, which is really the
Wait, that's sheer speculation, or there's evidence that
That's an allegation made in that Steele dossier.
That
somebody approached Carter Page and said, "We'll give you the brokerage fees on this big sale of Russia's oil company if you can then give us an end to sanctions." Now, sanctions haven't ended. Trump has been pressured or has ended up hiring some people who are actually pretty anti-Russian, but it is in fact the case that Rosneft share was sold in December, and the details of it are not public. So until we learn the details of that, although I suspect that the FBI and Department of Treasury know the details, we don't know the details. And so that is one of the alleged quid pro quos in that dossier. And then, there are some other, so that's the other thing, the quid pro quo and the golden goose for Russia is not necessarily the change in the Ukraine platform, but actually an ending of sanctions, because the sanctions are killing Putin and a lot of the other oligarchs.
And then, of course,
that's the second thing.
So there's we talked about Flynn, there's Carter Page, and then of course there's Manafort, who was already known to have gotten a lot of consulting money from pro-Russian Ukrainians, right? That's long been known. And was he still campaign manager at the time of the convention?
I believe he was. It was shortly thereafter that he was forced to resign.
So there's him.
Right, and New York Times actually had a story yesterday. This has been burbling up. Things are appearing on the internet. One of which is that $750,000 of the funds that were coming from these pro-Russian Ukrainians was laundered through a purported computer purchase. So, there is more smoke to Manafort that he did not disclose all of the funding he got from these Ukrainians, and that potentially he money laundered it. And there may be there's also some hints on the internet of other things that I won't go into, but there's probably a few more shoes about to drop on Manafort. But again, that doesn't necessarily imply any connection to Trump,
now,
right? There's no allegation there that Manafort, he was ousted before he had a really big policy role. As you said yesterday, Sean Spicer tried to pretend he was, minuscule.
Limited role was the term he used, I think, yeah.
But he's not in the administration. So, yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of smoke with Manafort, but it's not necessarily something that will implicate Trump directly.
Now, so we've been talking about quid pro quos. Now, those don't have an inherent connection to any Russian attempt to influence the election. In other words, you can imagine a situation where Russia wasn't trying to influence the election, wasn't hacking, but were covering their bases by feeding money into a bunch of people who might be influential in the administration that might wind up running America. So
that's true. But if you look at Comey's statement yesterday, he actually said they were investigating the Russian interference in the election. Any allegations of coordination between Trump's people and the Russians, and I'll get to that in a second, or any ties to Russia on the part of his close associates.
Okay, so
that third thing would get into quid pro quos for policy issues.
Right, but the coordination thing is interesting because there you see a possible connection that goes beyond quid pro quo per se and does involve, I guess, potentially the Trump campaign actually facilitating the Russia's influence on the American elections, right? And there, I haven't heard of anything concrete, and I don't know exactly what form that would take. Is this phraseology from Comey the first hint we've gotten that kind of collusion in an illicit influence on the election is part of the investigation?
Well, again, so the Steele dossier alleged both at the beginning of those discussions, Manafort was given information, basically Russian compromat, right? That he was dangled with information. We'll give you what we have on Hillary, sort of. Not clear that, in fact, the dossier never says that was delivered. At the end, the very last entry in that dossier, there is an allegation that Michael Cohen, who again is Trump's personal lawyer, was in discussions about Trump's campaign contributing money to pay the hackers for the investigation. So there are reasons I don't trust the dossier. There are reasons I don't trust the provenance of the dossier as we've gotten it. But that allegation is in the dossier as it was released by BuzzFeed. The other thing, there are two other things. One is, Roger Stone, longtime rat fucker, right? I love to point out that Roger Stone was rat fucking American elections when Vladimir Putin was just in law school.
Can we pause and pay tribute to my former boss, Mike Kinsley? When I was at the New Republican, I don't know, this was the late 80s, early 90s, Mike ran a cover. It was a piece by Jacob Weisberg. And, on the cover was a cartoon image of Roger Stone, and the headline on the cover was, Roger Stone's state-of-the-art Washington sleazeball. There was your prescient, cover story. So anyway, go ahead.
Right. And here's the thing. I mean, through the entire election, all the Democrats every week, they're like, oh, there's this word the Russians have. It's kompromat. I'm like, right. But we have the word rat fucking, and Roger Stone is as good at that as anybody, ask Eliot Spitzer, ask any number of people.
Yeah,
right?
he set up Eliot Spitzer for his downfall, apparently. Yeah.
Right. And so Roger Stone, associated with the Trump campaign and then allegedly ousted from the campaign, again, even earlier than Manafort was, but a longtime buddy of Trump. You talk about sleazeballs, but after this figure, so there was a figure that kind of appeared right after the Democrats announced that they had been hacked, called Guccifer 2.
Right.
And Guccifer 2 was the first release of some of the stolen Democratic documents. There was another DC Leaks that was releasing other kinds of documents, but Guccifer 2 was releasing, an opposition research thing against Trump and details on donors and so on and so forth. And that Guccifer 2 character was on Twitter, had emails, was talking to journalists, and as it turns out, was also talking to Stone. And that
was first known a couple of weeks ago. Now, I gotta say, there is this Twitter exchange between Stone and Guccifer, and I don't know how it was disclosed. I don't think it was Stone's idea. But I will say that conversation had the feel to me of two people who actually just met on Twitter or are communicating for the first time. Right? I mean, it didn't seem like covert communication between long-standing co-conspirators, right?
Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if Stone, being who he is, was trying to figure out who he was and what he could learn from him. That doesn't necessarily say he is. Now, and the interesting thing is you used the word colluding. Yesterday, Jim Comey made a big stink about preferring the word coordinate, which ties to legal statutes. He said there is nothing in the law about colluding. Whatever, he's the lawyer. I'll take his word for that. So, but in his mind, he is differentiating between colluding and coordinating. And what Stone was doing was more closely associated with coordinating. Ditto his conversations through Sean Hannity to Julian Assange from WikiLeaks, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's been this 180 where lefties used to like Julian Assange and now hate him, and righties who wanted to shoot him now are going into the Ecuadorian embassy and interviewing him. But so Hannity was definitely in touch with Assange, and Stone has said that he had a go-between, which is probably Hannity. And so whatever Hannity learned from Assange, Stone learned. The thing is that Stone was saying things in September like, well, John Podesta's next. Now, the funny thing about that is there were a number of people who knew what was coming down the pike.
Giuliani said something prescient at some point, I think, about what was coming. Some hint. I forget what it was.
But but I guess my point is that it wasn't, you wouldn't need to go to Russia to figure some of that out. Right. And frankly, John Podesta has been all over the map about what he knew about his emails coming out. Uh-huh. So, it's one of the parts of the Democrat story that doesn't hold together. Because he has both said he had no idea on October 7th that his emails were about to drop, but he also said that one of the first documents that came out he believed had come from him, meaning he knew they had gotten into his emails in June. So I guess what I'm saying is what people actually knew and what was being spoken about publicly in the August and September timeframe, those are different things. And so Stone's knowledge may be either innocently gotten through Guccifer 2 without confirmation that he was Russian. I think the case on Guccifer 2 is easily the weakest part of the public case that Russia was behind the hack. Or had gotten it from Julian Assange, who wasn't, always was making announcements that he had something coming down the pike. Mm-hmm. And Julian Assange, even still, the intelligence community hates him, has hated him since 2010, but they still are not saying that he was a Russian agent. They still don't have that proof. Mm-hmm. They're calling him, somebody who unwittingly was being used by the Russians. Mm-hmm. So any of those things don't amount to, I think, charges against Roger Stone, but who knows? Mm-hmm. I will say there's a part of this story that's still, and even in yesterday's hearing, remains unexplained. And so here's another place where I think a case may be made. It may not be made against people close to Trump, but the FBI has always said they weren't clear how the documents got from what they have publicly claimed was military intelligence from Russia, how they got from Russia's spies to Julian Assange, right? And Comey actually reconfirmed that yesterday.
Well, isn't it easy to get documents to Julian Assange anonymously? Doesn't WikiLeaks have a technical infrastructure that just allows anybody to get stuff to WikiLeaks? Or?
True, but I believe that FBI probably has that pretty well wired. NSA probably has that pretty well wired.
Huh.
The technology to get to WikiLeaks, whatever. Let's just trust that NSA has Julian Assange and other WikiLeaks people pretty well wired by this point. But they kept saying we don't even know if they're the same documents. And Comey yesterday used the phrase cutout, which has been used. And Julian Assange has said that he believes the first set of documents came from somebody inside the DNC. Craig Murray, who's the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, has said that he played a cutout role and he got something, maybe not documents, but he got something in September from somebody he believed to have ties to U.S. national security, as if, an FBI agent or something like that. So the WikiLeaks side of thing is alleging that their cutouts, both of them, two separate cutouts, were both American. And if that's true, that's news, and we still don't know who those cutouts are. So it sounds like you're far from convinced that the hacks were done by the Russians, the DNC hacks? No. I'm sure that the Russians hacked. You are? I'm sure, okay. And two different sets of Russians. The first FSB came in from July 2015 until everyone was kicked out in June. And then military intelligence, what is alleged to be military intelligence, and this is less certain, came in March 2016. They're the ones who also allegedly phished Podesta. I think the case on both of those things is very good. I've talked to people very close to the hack, and they've given me descriptions that are even, more robust than what's in the public record about where in Russia people were hacking and how they behaved while they were in their servers. So yeah, they definitely were hacked by Russia. Okay. The question is, were they the only people hacking? Did anybody follow, military intelligence in? Did, Assange has claimed it was a leak. I think Assange, there was a cutout. I'm still inclined to believe that what Assange got, he got from a cutout. Meaning a cutout being a go-between whose ultimate source he was not aware of. Is that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that allows Assange to, however much evidence there is that this was Russia, to still claim that he's not a Russian agent. Right. It allows, right. So that serves everybody. But regardless, Assange and Murray both claim that their source was American. And that's a part of the story that has not gotten a lot of attention and should, because if there are Americans who served as a cutout from Russia to Julian Assange, I'd like to know about it, right? That to me is one of the more scandalous parts of the story. Well, is it conceivable that they had a connection to the Trump campaign? Is that the suggestion? Possible, although, again, Assange says that the first guy had ties to the Democratic Party. Yeah. But it also seems, a couple of the possibilities here seem to kind of strain credulity. To my mind, that's like one of them. If the Russians have this stuff, there's lots of ways to get them to Assange without funneling them through this dangerous conduit of the Trump campaign. Dangerous in the sense that it could be exposed. Right. And the other thing is, and it didn't sound like you were taking this that seriously, the idea that the Trump campaign actually paid the hackers. Again, why do it that way, right? There's lots of ways to pay hackers. So anyway. And by the way, what I've been told by somebody close to the hack about how the hackers got paid is not consistent with what the dossier says. Right. So, I don't know which of those stories is correct, but certainly there is an alternative story. We saw the Yahoo indictment last week with one person named in the sanctions against Russia, and one of the guys involved in the Yahoo hack, who, by the way, was paid for phishing, for exactly the kind of thing that got Podesta, that got a bunch of other Democrats. He was paid via online payment system, so actually PayPal among others, which sounds crazy, but regardless. And that seems more consistent with what we know about how hackers get paid than via a pension system in the Russian embassy, which is the dossier's claim. Okay. So of the two kinds of
smoking gun there could be. One about quid pro quo, Russians buying either something in the Republican platform or buying an actual American policy. And the other being some kind of collusion or coordination between Trump campaign and the Russians in actually influencing the American election. Seems to me like neither of those is very likely to bless us with a smoking gun, even if there is something there. Am I wrong about that?
That you could prosecute?
Yeah.
I think that you could prosecute is the big thing. Now, obviously, impeachment is a political act, not a legal act. And so if too many of these smoking guns ended up I think the Manafort stuff may actually come to fruition. There's been reports that Ukraine was trying to get information on Manafort. Yesterday, Comey said, we're working really closely with Ukrainian authorities. So, I wouldn't be surprised if something happened with Manafort. But again, there's no allegation in the substance of what concerns him that Trump knew about it. There may be clear allegations that Russians were trying to influence him knowing he was close to Trump, but that doesn't necessarily implicate Trump.
Right.
And the bigger substance there is that he was acting as an influence peddler and not doing the legal paperwork required and maybe money laundering some of it as well. So that's Manafort's problem, which I think is separate from the allegations against Stone, against Carter Page, against Flynn, because all of those people are much closer to Trump and Trump's policies or Trump's campaign.
Although Stone and Page had a less formal connection to the campaign than Manafort had. And none of those three ever wound up in his administration.
Right. Yep. Because they were already toxic by then.
Right.
And so that's the thing. And now you've cleared Flynn out. And as I said, seeing Flynn file these declarations belatedly, that's the kind of thing you do when DOJ has gone to you and said, oh, by the way, we're looking at you for non-disclosure. I mean, for him, it's actually a real problem not disclosing these things because I think he is at least understood to have kept his security clearance from the time he was DIA director through when he was cleared as national security advisor. Regardless, getting re-cleared as national security advisor would require being forthcoming about all the foreigners you've met with. And the fact that he not only wasn't forthcoming about that, but also didn't include he was getting money from them, that creates a lot more problem for him than it would for, say, Carter Page, who didn't have clearance and didn't get clearance.
Okay. Now, I had said that we would get to a kind of connection between the two headlines generated by Comey. In other words, a kind of connection between Trump's weird wiretapping claim about Obama and this issue of Russian involvement in the election. And here we come back to your blog, because this is, one of the reasons people, I think, should read your blog, is because sometimes they'll see stuff there before they hear it in the mainstream media. And an example of that is actually this, right after Trump made the wiretapping claim, so far as I can tell, the main, newspapers and so on were going, we have no idea what this guy is talking about. And you did a blog post that I read, and as I understood it, put a finer point on things. And the impression I got was this: tell me if I'm wrong, or tell me if you've changed your mind since then, if I'm not wrong. That if you look at what in the kind of right-wing media Trump picked up on that led him to say this wiretapping thing, and what basis in any kind of fact did any of it have, it actually gets back to this story in Slate by Franklin Foer that got a huge amount of attention. I just looked at it the other day, this is before the election. Hillary retweeted it, for example.
Hillary retweeted it almost immediately.
I just looked at it
4 times or 3 times.
And I think we now have reason to believe that it's, in some sense of the word, fake news. Not that Frank Foer was faking it, but that there was less there than meets the eye. And by the way, I just looked at it the other day. It had 250,000 Facebook likes. Now, in my experience in journalism, if you want to know how many people actually had clicked on it and at least looked at the piece, you can kind of multiply by 10. So we're talking about millions of people probably read this piece. And anyway, it was about this computer with some connection to Trump. I guess it was the computer of a marketing firm enlisted by maybe Trump's campaign or something. Trump's organization.
Had nothing to do with the campaign.
So even further removed from the campaign. Yeah. And there was some kind of communication between it and Russian computers. And the premise of this whole Slate piece that was so widely read was that there was something suspicious about the activity, the communication between this computer and the Russian computer. So far as I can tell, that is what lies at the bottom of the right-wing media speculation that led Trump to say Obama had wiretapped him. That seems to be the case?
Yeah, so the story itself was a little bit ridiculous because, I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the only other entity that was supposed to be doing lookups to this Trump account, right, that wasn't actually run by Trump. It was run by a marketing server, and it was hosted by somebody else.
So doing lookups means what?
Basically, it's as if you looked up something in the phone book to figure out how to get to a website to deliver mail. So this
computer with this distant connection to Trump is looking things up? It's doing the looking up?
And the bank coming back to Trump. So there's
the Russian bank, the Alpha Bank.
I mean, this is not technically correct, but I called it pings, right? So you've got these two servers, actually two at this bank, but two servers pinging back to Trump. But the other entity that was pinging back to Trump was a local hospital to me that in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
So you have been drawn into the plot.
Well,
you are now possibly a co-conspirator because you.
No, I got pitched the story early on,
No.
And aside from the technical aspects of it, they were using the fact that Spectrum Health has ties to the DeVos family, now Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, to insinuate that it was this triangle. And what was stupid about it was that at the time these pings were happening in the summer, the DeVos family rather conspicuously was not funding Trump. They fund Republican anything, but they did not fund Trump until September. So the notion that there was this sordid conversation going on between the DeVosses and Trump back in the summer was not backed by what we locally knew the DeVosses were kind of conspicuously not doing, which they weren't yet backing Trump. And so, and that's how they that's how they explained that part of the story. And there were other parts of the story, like it's all backed by this guy named Tea Leaves, and no one saw the original files. Nobody could replicate the original files. There are allegations that they were doctored. So that story, I think, is most likely a hoax. So
whoever was the source for Frank Foer's story was perpetrating a hoax.
Under the name Tea Leaves.
Under the name Tea Leaves. So you don't even think that the records were authentic. I mean, one scenario is that, look, it was, one scenario I heard was that, look, and this is from an Intercept piece shortly after the Frank Foer piece, was that, look, so far as we can tell, all that was going on between these two computers was some kind of spam exchange and, routine stuff. And this computer was probably doing it with a whole bunch of other computers. We just weren't told that. Probably Frank Foer was not told that.
What the Intercept showed is that at each level of pitching the story, the number of other computers, other servers pinging, not the technical term, pinging the Trump server was minimized. So it started out at 19 and then turned into 2 for the story that got pitched to 4. So that's where I find it suspicious. The story itself was packaged. So there were clearly these pings, but they got packaged. Since then, the bank in question, Alpha Bank, has alleged that they're being hacked to create the appearance of these pings, which is technically child's play.
Okay.
So it's possible that happened in the summer as well, but they're alleging that happened now and have invited the FBI in. But the bigger story is, so that story, the server in question was in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And this woman, Louise Mensch, former Tory MP turned rock promoter, housewife, and, citizen journalist, wrote a piece for a Murdoch outlet in November reporting that there was a FISA order in the case. And she misreported the Foer story. and said that the server in question, Ford hadn't talked about where the server was, but a lot of people by then had already talked about the server being in Pennsylvania. But she misreported and said that the server was in Trump Tower. There was never an allegation that there was a server in Trump Tower. She misreported that. Mark Levin, for his radio show, and this is interesting. So Mark Levin does this piece the night that Jeff Sessions recuses. Okay? And Trump, according to reports, was as furious as he's been since he's been president. Trump, Sessions shouldn't have recused. Don McGahn, the White House counsel, should have intervened and made sure that he didn't recuse. Trump is furious. Mark Levin goes on his radio show and picks up a bunch of stuff that had been floating out there in this giant game of telephone and kind of ups the ante and turns it into a wiretap on Trump Tower. That's picked up by Breitbart, by a former campaign official. Former Trump campaign official, picked up by Breitbart the next day. That's printed out. It's put before Trump. Trump reads that in paper form, takes to Twitter, and accuses Obama of wiretapping Trump Tower. So that's where that came from. We know that's where that came from.
And the most it actually could have been, and I gather we don't even know this, is that there was some sort of FISA request from the Obama Justice Department to look at the activity of a computer that was run by a company that had contracted to the Trump organization, not the Trump campaign. I mean, that's the most there could be, and we don't even know there could be that.
Well, not even that.
It's not even that. There's nothing there at all.
So what happened is the banks in question that are supposed to be of interest are Alpha Bank and another Russian bank. These two banks that I probably were suspected of laundering money for the hackers through to the United States through this Russian pension system. So that's where the order exists. If it exists, no big national security journalist in the United States has confirmed that. But that's what exists if it exists. And this same woman, Louise Mensch, kind of conflated the marketing server story with this bank server story because Alpha Bank featured in both. And conflating them, put it in Trump Tower. And so, if there is an order, it's on banks. It's on banks on their own property. It's not at Trump Tower. It would pick up transfers between, say, the bank and maybe Paul Manafort or the bank and Michael Cohen. That's where the investigation is. There was no substance, but one thing that I find really interesting is, so after Sessions recuses, after a Trump appointee loses control of the investigation, Trump starts inventing these claims that the investigative methods are far greater than what they actually are, and that they're illegitimate. And there's nothing about the wiretap that picked up Mike Flynn that is illegitimate. It was targeted at the Russian ambassador. That's a common target. Right.
The leak you could argue about, but the fact of the tap.
Totally wrong, totally unusual. I'm sympathetic with Republicans on that front, but that he was picked up is completely normal. That he was unmasked, also completely normal. But what Trump is trying to do now, and this probably comes, given what we learned yesterday from Comey, it probably comes after the White House got briefed about what the substance of the investigation is. And Trump is spending all of his time doubling and tripling down. Then he picked up from Fox this GCHQ allegation. To suggest that the surveillance that is being conducted as part of this investigation is illegitimate, and there's no indication that that's the case.
So it sounds like Trump was terrified at the consequences of Sessions recusing himself and not being maybe in control of things. And I have a question about that. Before we get to that question, I know we've got to get you to your yoga class, which means you've got to leave in about 5 minutes, or you will not have peace of mind for God knows how long.
I won't get my mat space in the yoga room.
Yeah, well, yoga is a cutthroat business, I know. Two quick things. First of all, as for Frank Foer, I mean, I know him. He's definitely a journalist of integrity. If his sources were faulty, he didn't know it when he wrote the piece. And I would further say in his defense, as I recall, he brought in a kind of expert who actually has credibility in the computer community, who kind of said, yeah, this looks a little weird. So he kind of did some due diligence, but all of that aside, who would go to the trouble? Do you have any thoughts about who would go to the trouble to just make up it took some expertise and some trouble to try to, plant a fake story like this. We're no longer talking about Russia. We're talking about somebody who wants Hillary to win the election, right? Do you have any theory on who this might be?
I have a bunch of theories. One possible theory, and right now I suspect the people who are, if in fact Alpha is right that they're being hacked and they're being basically framed as having ties to Trump, I suspect that is left favorable people somewhere who are hiding their tracks. But the one in the summer, I have various theories, but one of them, frankly, is that Russia knew where this investigation was going. There is reason to believe that Russia was getting feedback loops. If they did, and part of the dossier, incidentally, has this weird report on Alpha Bank and its ties to Putin. Mm-hmm. So clearly Steele was being asked questions. Can you go figure out how close Alpha Bank is to Putin? Given that kind of feedback loop, I could see why people might, it's like a limited hangout, right? Here's a story that I know is going to collapse, to discredit any further ties on the Alpha Bank. I mean, that's one theory. Mm-hmm. There are other theories, but it is notable that Hillary Clinton picked it up and frankly issued a press release within half an hour of the Forrest story. So, it may be that the Democrats had heads up on that too, or that they were, I mean, that story was aggressively marketed. And given that the ultimate source for the story never called himself anything but tea leaves, I think that's pretty remarkable. As you're right, there were a bunch of kind of assisting computer science experts who validated that what they were looking at said what they were looking at. But it's a remarkable story, and I don't know the story. I'd love to trace it more because I think that's a really interesting question.
Okay, final question before you go claim your yoga mat. Should Trump be terrified that Sessions recused himself, or isn't it possible that we could wind up with a deputy attorney general overseeing the investigation and making sure that everything is under control?
Well, we have Dana Bente right now, who's the U.S. attorney for Eastern District of Virginia. He's a career prosecutor, a hard nose. He's the guy prosecuting Edward Snowden, Kim.com, WikiLeaks. There's no reason to believe he'd go easy on Trump. He's one of Obama's appointees, and Rod Rosenstein, who will be appointed as the deputy attorney general, and therefore will take over for Dana Bente. He was appointed by Bush, stayed through the entire Obama administration. He's the guy who investigated James Cartwright. And charged James Cartwright with charges that he was immediately pardoned for. But he also is a longtime prosecutor that both people on both sides of the aisle really respect.
It's kind of strange that Sessions would choose a deputy that people on both sides respect. I mean, wouldn't you think Trump would really want the deputy AG to be on board? I mean, Trump is just the kind of guy who, let's face it, he wants to play hardball.
And dismantle government, yeah.
Yeah, and you'd think he'd really want a team player as deputy AG.
Yeah, no, I have to say, even the associate attorney general, who is a very conservative lawyer, former lawyer for the chamber, Rachel Brand, I have a lot of respect for. She used to serve on P Club, so she'll also be confirmed. She's also very qualified. So I don't know, maybe we got lucky with DOJ and have actually competent appointees coming in for those two positions. But Rod Rosenstein is somebody that can be trusted, I think, to oversee the investigation, at least as far as I know. Okay. Well, now we will liberate you. Thanks so much, Marcy. And again, people should read your blog, Empty Wheel. And what's your Twitter handle? Also Empty Wheel. Also Empty Wheel. And so thank you, Marcy Wheeler. You're now yoga bound. You've earned it. This has been very illuminating, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk down the road. All right. Thanks so much. Okay. Bye-bye.